Today on Uncommon Knowledge, is it getting hot in here?
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, global warming. What do we know, and what should we do? This summer's big disaster movie, The Day After Tomorrow, depicts a world in which a sudden climate change plunges us all into a new ice age. While they agreed that the movie is over the top, some scientists argue that a climate change, even a very sudden climate change, is indeed possible, and that it could indeed be caused by human activity. So, does the evidence indicate that the accumulation of so-called greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels is truly making the world warmer? And if so, what should we do about it? Joining us today, two guests. Fred Smith is president and founder of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Carl Pope is executive director of the Sierra Club and the author of Strategic Ignorance: How the Bush Administration is Recklessly Destroying a Century of Environmental Progress. Fred Krupp, president of Environmental Defense, quote, "When history books are written, global warming will be the issue that defines President Bush's environmental legacy," close quote. That is a true or false question. Carl?
I doubt it.
You doubt it. Fred?
Possibly.
Possibly. As far as I can tell, everything I'm about to say is true. Arctic ice is melting. Lakes and rivers in the northern hemisphere freeze a week later than they did 150 years ago. Glaciers from the Rockies to Mount Kilimanjaro are shrinking. And, this is absolutely true, in 2001, the United Nations-sponsored Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that global warming, quote, has been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations, close quote. So can we take it as scientifically established that the globe is getting warmer and that it is doing so as the result of human actions? Carl?
Most of the evidence suggests that it's due to human actions, but what's more important is that we understand that if we keep on adding greenhouse pollutants to the atmosphere, if we keep changing the composition, we will change the amount of energy the atmosphere stores, the amount of heat, and we will change the way in which the atmosphere behaves. So what we know for certain is that if we keep on doing what we're doing, which is changing the composition of the atmosphere, a whole bunch of things are going to happen eventually, which we won't control,
but you're skittering
and we can't predict.
You're skittering away from the matter of what is responsible for the actual observed global warming in such a quick and rapid fashion that it suggests to me there's a weakness in your argument there.
No,
you don't want to address that one.
No, I'm going to address. Most of the scientists think it is, but I have to say
but most scientists do think
that the
consensus is
that the current signature, what they call the signature, most scientists are saying the current signature is consistent with man-made changes in global climate and not with anything else. But I have to say that if you then push them and say, well, is it possible that it's something else? They will say it's conceivable but very unlikely.
Fred?
Yeah, well, what I think I agree with Carl on this. What the models have done is essentially calibrate themselves on the presumption that additional carbon dioxide levels in the environment explain the temperature changes of the last century, where we've had about 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit, uncontestable. To do that, though, you've got to do a lot of manipulation of what feedback effects in the model. You have to calibrate the model, fudge the model to make it meet reality. Now we've discovered that there are a number of other factors, some anthropogenic, land use clearing, and
anthropogenic meaning
human affected, some non, solar variability, ocean current variability, a lot of other factors, and then these other factors are increasingly relevant, or potentially relevant, and none of the models take them into account. So if in fact they are more relevant, as we're learning they are, then in fact the models don't predict anything.
Okay, now let's look at a few statistics that seem to cast doubt on whether human activity is indeed the cause of global warming. Much of the warming over the last century took place between 1900 and 1940, before greenhouse gases start to accumulate significantly in the atmosphere. And in fact, from 40 to 70 or so, the temperature falls. The theory of greenhouse warming predicts warming in the lower atmosphere, but satellite Measurements over the last several decades have shown no such warming. And we have, during the Middle Ages, the Earth is a couple of degrees warmer than it is today. So, James Schlesinger, former Secretary of Energy, I quote him, "The lessons of our recent history and of this longer history, going back to the Middle Ages, are clear. It is not possible to know now how much of the warming over the last 100 years was caused by human activities and how much was because of natural forces." That's an old-fashioned view? That's just wrong?
No, I think that's a temperate view of what we know. We've learned a lot about climate change. As we learn more, some of the factors that weren't initially considered relevant have become relevant. That means, effectively, whatever greenhouse gas effects might be have dropped in proportion. And the timing, as you point out, is not consistent with the view of a simple relationship, anyway, between greenhouse gases and warming.
Now, the point of this...
Are you worried about something that's happening in practice or something that's happening in theory? That's the question.
I'm happening about something that's happening in practice, which is we're changing the composition of the world's atmosphere. That's happening in practice, and that we know. And wait. But the important thing is we actually don't know what consequences that will have in a level of certainty that is at all reassuring for the future.
So we're not going to say that the globe is, what we've experienced of warming is the result of human agency. We're not so sure about that.
We're going to say that the scientists have concluded it's likely, but the scientists can't tell us it's absolutely certain.
And if you look from the
You'll grant that.
Well, only with the following proviso, that the IPCC executive report, the news release, sounds more certain than the underlying science does. So we have a public relations campaign that is trying to impute more certainty than actually the data.
But you'll grant, all right, so now you go ahead and reframe the debate now, which is that what we know for certain and what might, go ahead, reframe
what we know
that,
for certain is that we're changing the composition of the atmosphere. We know for certain that we are adding gases to the atmosphere which retain more heat, which is energy. We are energizing the atmosphere.
All right.
And we also know that our ecological systems in human societies are very finely calibrated to predictable climates. We don't deal well, and ecosystems don't deal well with rapid climate change.
This is the problem of Californians who actually think climate stays the same throughout the year. In the rest of the United States,
is not climate.
In the rest of the United States, they are very dramatic from night to day and from season to season. And indeed, over the man's history, recorded history, we've gone through periods when we have had warmer weather, and periods of warmer weather have actually coincided with periods of human flowering.
Hold on. Carl said we're pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
That's true.
And he's saying the chances are very good that that's going to warm the globe, and we ought to be extremely careful about that. And you're saying, don't worry about it. A couple degrees a century, it'll be fine.
We're changing the globe we live on. Man has been doing that for 10,000 years. We've changed the foods we eat. We've changed the way land is used. All of those have effects on climate, some good, some bad, and man has continuously adapted to that and has become more resilient, and that's a challenge. Do we prevent greenhouse global warming, or do we learn to live with its benefits and its costs?
Okay, now, next, what do we know about the rate at which climate changes may occur? Most arguments about global warming and greenhouse gas emissions with which I'm familiar over recent years suggest a slow warming. This degree, point something or other per century, maybe a couple of degrees a century. However, we now have in the public debate a quite different model, the tipping point model. Apparently, according to Fortune magazine, the Department of Defense commissioned a report suggests the melting ice cap could cause the Gulf Stream to shut down. So we've got two. One is slow and take it easy, and we can learn to adapt to it, would be sort of the implicit argument that I would anticipate from you. And the other is, wait a minute, we could be in for catastrophic changes within a decade or two. Which is your worry? Which do you consider most likely?
It's most likely that we're going to see a series of relatively slow, but still very disruptive changes. It is, however, you say what worries me.
Yes.
I worry about catastrophic, even low probability events. You could have a tipping point, and it would be catastrophic. Now, it's not highly probable.
On this same model that Fortune magazine wrote about, and that shutting down the Gulf Stream.
They thought it was a 1% event. I mean, most of the scientists I've talked to say that's probably a 1% event.
1% chance over what period of time?
Over a couple hundred years. Over a couple hundred years. And okay, a 1% event of a catastrophe is something worth worrying about. We all worry about things that might kill us, even though they're only 1% likely to kill us.
Is there a surprise, as they put it? The chances are 1%, I think much less than that, because in effect, the one example we know of the shutting down of the Gulf Stream was 10,000 years ago when there was a vast freshwater lake over Canada. There is no such lake now. Any effects are going to be much slower and can be readily reduced by building dams on the Canadian and Russian rivers. But the real question is, he's worried about the downside of change. Mankind has been changing this planet in many, many ways, some very good, some not so good, and we're changing the planet more. The question is whether he worries about global warming surprises. I worry about global warming policy surprises, because nothing could be more disastrous to the future of the world than suppressing the use of affordable energy.
Carl, surprise him. Give him a policy surprise. You have now sketched out your worry. What do you want to do about it?
What I want to do at the beginning is to recognize the fact that right now people who take from the global commons don't have to pay for what they take. Violates all market theory. When I go to the grocery store, I have to pay for what I take for it. Right now, the people who are taking the capacity of the global atmosphere to absorb CO2 are paying for it. Let's say that the only thing that happens as a consequence of global warming is we get more frequent typhoons off the Bay of Bengal. That's the only change. And, you know, 10,000 people a year die in Bangladesh. Where did we get the right to hijack the composition of the global atmosphere in a way that kills 10,000 people in Bangladesh a year? We don't have that right, and we ought to be paying for what we're doing with carbon dioxide. And let me say something.
What do you do about it? What do you do about it?
We make people.
I mean, Fred's not going to say we have the right to kill people.
Raise gas taxes, I suspect.
Is that what you want to do?
But again, Carl is pointing out the downside of the situation. Let's go on the other side. Anything that makes it harder for the Bangladeshis of the world to handle storms that already exist, independent of any anthropogenic causes. Florida has hurricanes. When Florida experiences a hurricane, because of our technology and our wealth, we know it's coming. We have SUVs to move us out of harm's way. We have the wealth to build brick houses rather than stick houses. And we basically have disasters that are relatively modest and people don't die.
And your point is that the reaction to global warming by people like Carl takes this form, that form, or the other, but broadly speaking, they are all to retard economic development.
Well,
retard
the use of fossil-based fuels, which in today's world, and probably for at least 50 years, means retarding economic growth, meaning Bangladesh becomes less like Florida than it could otherwise be with economic growth.
You are going to keep poor people poor around the globe.
No, I'm not going to keep poor people poor. Because, in fact, what we are doing, the fact that we don't pay what we ought to be paying for the right to emit carbon dioxide into the world, if we paid for it, there would be money available to develop Bangladesh. We are not paying for what we're using. All I'm saying is the people who are going to benefit ought to be paying.
This prominent official in the Sierra Club wants to use market mechanisms to address the problem.
Indeed, I do.
Not bad.
I want to make people pay for what they use, which is a believable.
And how exactly would you do that?
You're talking like
market mechanisms are one of those interesting little weasel words that basically goes back to the real debate that Hayek and von Mises had with Lerner and Abba Lerner and Oscar Lange. What were they arguing? That socialism fails, but market mechanisms, the clever use of tax and quota systems designed to allow government to pick the targets of society and the market to steer us there, is, of course, being reintroduced in the way of global warming and other environmental policies. The question is what we should do about the environment. How to get there is an important question.
Give me your answer.
What I think we should do is liberalize the entrepreneurial and technological forces the world needs to make it possible for the Bangladesh, well, the things that we're beginning to do already. Economic liberalization around the world, vastly better.
Next, the Kyoto Protocol on climate change.
Kyoto, signed in December 1997 by the United States and 37 other nations, would have required the signatories to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide and 5 other heat-trapping gases to an average of 5% below their 1990 levels by 2012. The United States, there varies among the members, an average of 5. The United States agreed to cut its emissions to 7% below 1990 levels. However, it was a non-starter. The Senate of the United States voted 95-0 to oppose the Kyoto Protocol, and Clinton never even sent it up to the Senate. And in this administration, Condoleezza Rice said Kyoto is dead. However, the European Union and the Russians have just struck a deal, and it looks as though Russia may join the Kyoto Protocol, and Kyoto is alive. Is Kyoto good, bad? Should the United States join the protocol? Tell me about Kyoto.
The United States should rejoin the process. If the United States has a better idea, and I certainly think I have some better ideas than Kyoto, we should lay them on the table. But the goal of the ideas should be to recognize the principle that we don't have the right to put risks on people in Bangladesh. We shouldn't gamble with the world's climates. We are being very wasteful in the way we use fossil fuels. It would not disrupt economic growth globally to be more careful about the way we use fossil fuels. And there are a bunch of different ways, wait a minute, there are a bunch of different ways that we can get a handle on this problem
That we can cut our emissions
regret.
by 7%?
Oh, more than that.
Without hampering our own economic
Without
growth.
hampering our own economic growth.
Well, it's a good theory. Look, the reason we use fossil fuels is because they were less environmentally damaging than the renewable energies we had earlier. We used to use wood to make charcoal, to make iron and steel. That denuded the United Kingdom, or this forest, and was rapidly denuding the United States. And then a better, more concentrated energy source, coal, became usable in that. And we saved the forests of the eastern United States, and indeed of the world, by moving to a more concentrated energy form. That form of energy, coal, oil, and natural gas, drive the engines of economic growth today, and there is nothing to replace them in the next 40, 50 years. We should be looking for alternatives, as the President's program is doing, but we should recognize that to curtail fossil fuel energy today means to curtail economic growth, to make the world more like Bangladesh.
You just
less
have a
like
fundamental
Florida.
disagreement that the use of fossil fuels can be curtailed quickly
No, I think
and sharply right now. Is that right
what
or
I'm
not?
saying is the use of fossil fuels are being wasted. We shouldn't waste them. If we price them properly, again, I'm talking here about market mechanisms. If we price them properly and we make people, for example, if people who want to burn coal have to make sure the mercury doesn't get out of the smokestacks and into the streams, then they'll be more likely to charge appropriate prices. We will buy better light bulbs. If people had to pay for the cost of protecting the Persian Gulf when they drive their SUVs, they would drive hybrid SUVs. They might still drive SUVs. There are a whole host of ways in which we can use energy more efficiently, diversify our
You're
energy
talking about
sources.
using the government as a rule-setting body. That is to say, not command and control.
All markets are based on governments as rule-setting bodies. Governments make
Well,
sure
but there
that
are
contracts
different
are
approaches to
And
environmental
I'm
policy.
I'm not saying we have to have command and control. I'm saying that those who take from the commons ought to pay for what they take, and without people's permission, you shouldn't have the right to do harm to them.
One of the reasons Russia, I think, is unlikely ever to actually ratify Kyoto, even though they're playing nicely with the Europeans today, because they want to get into the World Trade Organization. If you read the language closely and followed the debate, the Russian Academy of Sciences has said that in their view, the science of global warming is too shallow to permit any national action. And they are very prestigious. And there are economists that pointed out, and Putin has repeated, that what would be wrong with Siberia warming up 2 or 3 degrees? They recognize...
On to the Bush administration's approach to global warming.
3 principles in the current Bush policy. 1, the administration seeks reductions not in carbon emissions directly, but in carbon intensity of an economy, the ratio of carbon emissions to gross national product. I see looks of amusement and scorn on both your faces. If the carbon intensity of a country falls 10%, that country's economy can grow 10% without increasing the country's carbon emissions. Conceptually, a good way of thinking the problem through?
First of all, the reduction in carbon intensity is like being in favor of the law of gravity. It's going to happen unless we actually really screw up our economy.
Which he argues you're about to do.
No,
Yes, exactly.
but second, the fact is we need to reduce emissions because we're overloading the globe. We're changing the atmosphere's composition, and you can't reduce emissions by just reducing carbon intensity.
Which brings me to, hold on.
Exactly.
Television,
That's the point.
television,
Exactly.
so time is limited. This brings me to point 2 of our 3 in the Bush policy. Since the only way to cut carbon intensity is by developing, in their view, new low-carbon technologies, the administration is using government initiatives, heavy hand of government here, Fred, and funds, initiatives and money, to promote hydrogen cars, there's that smile, ways to burn coal without carbon emissions, and other low-carbon technologies. Baloney is what your face is telling me.
What I'm telling you is that it's all right to say, let's do research. No one's opposed to knowledge acquisition. But as Carl said earlier, reducing the intensity, the efficiency with which we transfer fossil fuels into useful activities, that is improving and will improve as long as we continue to deregulate, to privatize, and not only we, the world. There are dramatic amounts of wasted energy around the world, not much in the United States, actually. Many in the former Soviet economies where methane and gas is leaking out of pipelines.
In his State of the Union address, the president pledged billions of dollars. I don't recall them. It was single digits, $3 billion, $4 billion for the development of hydrogen cars. Take that in isolation. Was that a good proposal?
That was a head fake. That was a
He's using $3 billion
That was a fraud.
to buy
Fred
off
and I
the
will
Sierra
agree.
Club
No,
supporters,
he's
and
not-
it didn't work.
Well, that's right.
Well,
And
I think
Fred and I
it's just
will
policy, so you
agree.
both
Fred
agree
and I
with
will
that.
It was
agree
just
on that.
politics.
Hold
not
on,
gonna
third
come from
point,
Hoover.
and third point here in the Bush policy. The administration, again, I'm looking at you, the use of government power here, the administration is calling for voluntary compliance with emissions guidelines, and the Department of Energy is writing rules by which enterprises will keep detailed accounts of their greenhouse gas emissions. Now, wait a minute. Is this just politics, or is this the beginning of a vast new scope for federal regulation? In other words, I have the feeling that you're broadly supportive of George W. Bush, but don't you feel the urge to slap the administration around for this nonsense?
As a matter of fact, we have slapped the administration around on exactly this point. Our argument is if it's not a sinful activity, don't have to go to confession every year to the DOE. The argument is if we really understand that energy use is not something sinful, it's something, affordable energy is one of the great virtues, the democratization of energy use, which America's achieved, then the last thing you want to do is to demonize it by requiring that you report your picadillos each year.
Okay,
And creating
so-
a lobbying force among the Enrons or the future Enrons of the world to lobby for more of these kinds
And
of
by the way, on that hydrogen car business, the first thing that happened was that the chairman of GM said, what a wonderful idea.
Of course.
Okay, so in the Fred Smith view of the world, the environmental policy of George W. Bush runs from ridiculous to possibly harmful.
Incoherent, I would say, is a more logical way of saying it. What is
You'd agree with that. So we just,
No, I would
we
say
just
it's more than incoherent. It's actually malicious.
malicious because
Because they actually
it's
understand.
intentional. It's
They
intended to
understand.
confuse the political situation.
And they understand that this will not get them where they go. They understand their policies won't achieve the results they lay out for them, and they are simply offering that. In Frank Luntz's phrase, they are doing this so that the American people will not understand that on
Here's
climate
my
change,
guest.
the science
Here's
is
my
closed
guest,
against
Carl
them.
Pope. Fred, I turn him over to you for questioning.
So what would happen if they actually put in place, which they've tried to do in foreign aid generally, a program that said, we're going to try to do everything we can do by removing subsidies from sugar and other areas where you would already agree, free trade, by move aid from subsidy aid to direct investment by American firms in these countries, so the efficiency gains we have would be there. And effectively, we're going to try to make the world more like Florida and less like Bangladesh. That would be a program that would have economic benefits, but it would certainly have environmental benefits also.
Well, there are a lot of things. I mean, the administration, another thing you and I could probably agree about, frankly. If we just said, look, we're spending $180 billion a year on farm subsidies, and we're completely screwing up the world doing so.
Okay, hold on. However,
Let me press Carl on the connection between economic growth and global warming.
you have just granted an extremely large point, namely the Fred Smith's colorful contention that economic growth is good for the environment.
That's not a huge point. That is like common sense.
Wait a minute. It means that the continent of Africa suddenly starts, that the poor people in Bangladesh suddenly start pumping more greenhouse gas emissions into the
Look,
atmosphere.
the people in Bangladesh are going to pump more greenhouse gas into the bank. The people of China are. The challenge is to enable them to do so in a way, to grow in a different way than we did, so that at the end of the process, we're all using more energy, but we're all putting out less
of this
carbon.
television program, because I now understand Fred Smith's agenda, which is global growth, make people rich. It's environmentally good. Clearly, it's good for them. What exactly do you want to do?
What I think we ought to be doing is recognizing that these environmental problems involve impoverishing or taking things or putting at risk future generations and other communities. And we ought to move as rapidly, not instantly, not disruptively, but we ought to move rapidly in a consistent way to use better technology, stronger standards of accountability, better pricing, to actually ensure that we feed ourselves and get to work and clothe ourselves and house ourselves in ways that do minimum harm to other people in the future.
One follow-up question. The better pricing arises how? Not through the organic, unfettered workings of the market, but you have to have government involved to set rules and say you pay for that emission.
In some cases, you have to set rules. Yes, you have to set rules because in many cases, the people you're taking from are not able, in fact, to insist that you pay them. You don't actually have contractual relations between Exxon and Bangladesh.
So you get a bigger role for government in your plan, but it's as a rule setter.
Right.
Oh, you get about a 30-second rebuttal, and then we've got to move to the final question.
The question generally is, anything that makes the cost of energy higher in the United States, which, because this is a world market, means higher in the world, will slow the rate of the Bangladeshis of the world gaining the technological and economic ability to address their current environmental problems, and of course, to make it easier for them to address whatever future risk may or may not result.
Two predictions to round out the show. 5 years from now, will the United States have rejoined, if not signing the Kyoto Treaty, will we have rejoined a Kyoto process? Carl?
5 years from now, the United States will be back working with the rest of the world on how to solve this problem, because the American people will choose a new leadership in Washington if this leadership doesn't step up to the plate.
Fred?
Whether there's new leadership or not, I think America's rational approach to economic development, which is really reasonably good, Democratic and Republican, create wealth, create knowledge, and the world can absorb whatever risk we face, environmental or otherwise. That's what we want to do.
Second question, 50 years from now, will the ambient temperature on the planet be higher, lower, or about the same? What are we in for? Fred?
I think the world will allow a little bit more like Florida and California, a little less like Lake Wobegon in Minnesota. Most people would prefer that.
Carl?
Most people don't live in Minnesota, actually. I think people in the Sahara Desert in Bangladesh and India may not prefer that, and I think Fred's right, the world's going to be warmer.
Carl Pope, Fred Smith, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us. We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.